The afternoon sun was slowly fading behind the tall city buildings, painting the streets in shades of orange and gray. People moved fast, their steps quick and purposeful, as if the world had no time for slowing down. Cars honked, phones buzzed, and the air was filled with the usual noise of a busy downtown street. On one corner, near a small cafe that always smelled of fresh coffee and baked bread, sat a man who seemed invisible to most who passed by. He was thin, his hair long and tangled, his clothes old and wrinkled. The world had clearly not been kind to him. His hands were rough, his shoes worn to the sole, and beside him was a cardboard sign with a few words written in faded black marker. "Can I play for food?" He didn't speak loudly. He didn't beg. He just sat quietly, sometimes looking down at his hands, sometimes staring into the distance like he was lost in thought. Most people didn't even glance at him. Those who did gave that quick look of pity or discomfort, the kind that comes from wanting to care but not wanting to get involved. Inside the cafe, people laughed, talked, and scrolled through their phones. From the window, they could see the man sitting outside, but to them he was just part of the background, another homeless person in a city full of them. A young woman sitting near the window noticed him for a moment. She nudged her friend and said softly, "He's been sitting there for days. I think he sleeps around the corner." Her friend shrugged and went back to her coffee. Across the street, an older man who worked at a newspaper stand muttered to himself, "Poor guy. He's out there every day, same spot, same sign. Never causes trouble, though." The homeless man, whose name was David Miller, didn't hear any of it. He was too busy thinking about the life he used to have, a life that now felt like a story he once read but could barely remember. Years ago, David had worn a military uniform. He had served his country with pride and had once been known for his discipline, calm nature, and quiet confidence. Before that, even earlier in his life, he had been something else entirely, an artist of sound. Music had been his first love. The piano had been his world, but time and pain have a way of changing people. The war, the noise, the loss of friends, the silence afterward, they had taken something from him. And when he came back home, the world he returned to no longer fit him. Jobs came and went, relationships faded, and little by little the light in his eyes dimmed. Eventually he found himself alone, carrying nothing but memories and regrets. That was how he ended up here, sitting by a cafe with a sign and a hope that someone might give him a chance to play again. Not for fame, not for money, but simply for food. Every morning he woke up before dawn, washed his face in the public restroom nearby, and walked to the same spot. He placed the sign beside him, adjusted the small hat in front of him for change, and waited. Some days he made just enough for a sandwich. Other days he went to sleep hungry. Still, there was something different about David. Despite the rough life and tired body, his hands, and those hands that once danced across piano keys, still carried a certain grace. He often rubbed them together, feeling the old bones ache as if trying to remember the motion of playing. Occasionally someone passing by would stop, curious about his sign. "Play for food? You mean like music?" one man asked once, looking down at him. David had nodded, his voice calm but quiet. "Yes, sir. If there's a piano somewhere, I can play." The man had laughed, shaking his head. "There's no piano out here, buddy. You're in the wrong place." He walked away, leaving David staring at his sign. He wasn't angry. He was used to people doubting him. The truth was he hadn't played in years. But deep inside, he still believed that if he ever got the chance, if he could just sit in front of a piano again, the music would come back. It always did. One cold afternoon, a light wind picked up. David pulled his thin jacket tighter around him. A group of college students walked by, laughing loudly, their coffee cups steaming in the chill. One of them pointed at him and said, "Look, man, that dude's asking to play for food." "That's new." They laughed, but David didn't respond. He kept his head down. It wasn't the first time people had mocked him. Usually it was easier to stay silent than to explain himself. He had learned long ago that most people didn't really listen when someone like him spoke. But sometimes, silence spoke louder than words. A few minutes later, a child walked up to him, holding her mother's hand. She couldn't have been older than 6. She stared at the cardboard sign and then looked at him. "Can you really play?" she asked in a small voice. David smiled faintly. "I used to," he said. The girl's mother gave an embarrassed smile and gently tugged her daughter's hand. "Come on, sweetie, let's go." Before they left, the girl reached into her pocket and dropped a few coins into his hat. "Maybe you can play again someday," she said before walking away. David watched her go, his eyes soft. It was strange. He could go all day without speaking, but small moments like that stayed with him. They reminded him that kindness still existed, even if it came in the smallest ways. Later that evening, the cafe owner, a middle-aged man named Tom, stepped outside to take out some trash. He glanced at David, who was still sitting quietly. "You all right out here, man?" Tom asked, his tone cautious but not unkind. David nodded. "Yes, sir. Just a bit cold," Tom sighed. "You've been sitting here a lot lately. You cause no trouble, so I don't mind. But people talk, you know." David looked up. "I'm not here to bother anyone. Just hoping for a meal or two." Tom hesitated. "You say you can play? Piano, right?" David nodded again. "There's an old one inside," Tom said, scratching his head. "It's been sitting in the corner for years. Out of tune, probably. Used to belong to my wife before she passed. Haven't touched it since." David's eyes lifted slightly, a spark of something. Maybe hope, maybe curiosity. "Is it still playable?" Tom shrugged. "Barely. Keys stick. Pedal squeaks. But yeah, it works." There was a brief silence. The smell of roasted coffee drifted out into the cold air. "Maybe one day," David said softly, "I could play it. Just for a bit. If that's all right." Tom studied him for a moment, unsure. "We'll see," he finally said. "I gotta close up soon. You take care of yourself, okay?" David nodded. "Thank you, sir." After Tom went back inside, David leaned against the wall and looked up at the dimming sky. His hands were cold, but he rubbed them together again the way pianists do before they play. He closed his eyes and imagined the sound of keys under his fingers. Smooth ivory, warm tones filling the air, the rhythm of something he once knew better than words. For a few minutes, he wasn't a man sleeping on the streets. He wasn't the person people avoided or mocked. He was a musician again. A soul with music inside him waiting for a chance to be heard. That night he slept with a faint smile. It had been a long time since he'd felt a reason to hope. The next morning came with a light drizzle. The streets glistened with rain, and people hurried under umbrellas. David sat in his usual spot, the sign resting beside him. The world kept moving, unaware that just a few steps away sat a man with a story worth hearing. But things have a strange way of changing when you least expect them to. Sometimes life waits for the perfect moment, and the perfect crowd, before revealing the truth about someone. David didn't know it yet, but the world was about to hear him again. And when they did, they'd never forget the man who once asked, "Can I play for food?" The next few days passed quietly. The weather grew colder and the wind picked up, carrying dry leaves down the street. David stayed in his usual spot outside the cafe, his old jacket pulled tight around his shoulders. The little hat he used to collect coins was almost empty most days, but he didn't complain. He was used to having little, and somehow he still carried himself with a quiet kind of dignity that most people didn't notice. The cafe stayed busy as always. People came and went, laughing, chatting, and warming up with coffee before heading back to their lives. Through the window, David could sometimes see the piano sitting in the corner, the same one the cafe owner had mentioned before. It was covered with a light layer of dust, sitting silent, almost forgotten. Each time David looked at it, he felt something stirred deep inside him. Not sadness, but longing. He would close his eyes and imagine the way it felt to sit in front of one again. The smooth keys beneath his fingers, the way a melody could fill a room and quiet every other sound. For him, music wasn't just sound. It was peace. It was the one thing that had never turned its back on him. But the piano stayed inside and he stayed out. That Friday, the cafe was busier than usual. It was payday and the place was full of laughter, chatter, and the smell of roasted beans. David sat outside as usual, his sign resting on his knees. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. A few people tossed coins into his hat without looking. Others didn't even notice him. Then a group of young men stepped out of the cafe, their voices loud with energy and confidence. They were dressed in nice jackets and carried takeout cups. One of them, tall with neatly styled hair, noticed David's sign and laughed. "Can I play for food?" He read out loud, nudging his friends. "You serious, old man?" David looked up, his face calm, though his eyes looked tired. "Yes," he said softly. "If there's a piano somewhere, I can play." The group exchanged looks, half amused, half curious. Oh yeah? The tall one said. There's a piano inside, right? You saying you can actually play that thing? I can, David replied simply. Another one laughed. Man, that thing's probably older than him. It doesn't even work right. What are you gonna play, chopsticks? The others laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter exactly. Just the kind that comes from people who've never had to think twice about mocking someone. David didn't react. He'd been laughed at before. He'd been called worse. Tell you what, the tall man said finally, pulling a few bills from his wallet. You go in there and play something that sounds good, and this is yours. He waved the cash with a grin. His friends chuckled. Bro, he can't play, one of them said. He's bluffing. David looked at the money, then at the cafe. For a moment, he hesitated. He didn't want to be part of some joke, but something inside him whispered, it's time. He slowly stood up, his old knees stiff from sitting too long. The group quieted a bit, surprised that he was actually getting up. You serious? One of them asked. David nodded. You said there's a piano inside? The tall man smirked. Yeah, come on. Let's see what you got. They walked toward the cafe door. A few people nearby noticed the commotion and turned to watch. David followed quietly, his steps slow but steady. When they stepped inside, the warm air hit him, the smell of coffee, cinnamon, and baked bread. People turned their heads. The cafe owner behind the counter noticed David right away and frowned. Hey, you all right, buddy? The owner asked. Before David could answer, the tall man said, He wants to play your piano. Said he can play for food. The owner looked uncertain. You mean the old one in the corner? David nodded. If it's all right with you, sir. Just one song. The cafe went silent. Some customers whispered. A few pulled out their phones, sensing something unusual was about to happen. Tom, the owner, hesitated. He had told David about the piano before, but he hadn't really expected him to ask. After a moment, he sighed and nodded. All right, go ahead. Just don't break it, he said with a half smile. David smiled faintly. Thank you. He walked slowly toward the corner of the cafe where the piano sat. Dust covered the surface, and a few of the keys were yellowed with age. He reached out and wiped it gently with his sleeve, as if touching an old friend after a long time apart. People watched closely. The group of young men stood near the counter, still grinning but a little quieter now. David sat down on the small wooden bench. He stretched his fingers, flexing them one by one. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He placed them on the keys and pressed lightly, testing the sound. Some of the keys stuck. The pedal squeaked just as Tom had said. Then he closed his eyes. The first few notes were soft, uncertain, like a whisper. Then slowly the sound began to fill the air. The noise in the cafe faded as the music grew stronger. His hands moved gracefully, remembering the rhythm they thought they'd forgotten. The melody was smooth, deep, and full of emotion, something classical yet alive with soul. Every note told a story. The chatter stopped. Even the sound of the coffee machine seemed to disappear. People stood frozen, watching. The young men who had mocked him earlier were no longer laughing. Their grins had faded, replaced by awe. David didn't look at anyone. He wasn't playing for them. He wasn't even playing for food anymore. He was playing for the years he had lost, for the silence he had endured, for the love of the music that had once defined his life. Each note carried weight. Each pause carried memory. The melody rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady, emotional, raw. When he reached the end, he slowed his hands, letting the last chord hang in the air. The sound lingered, echoing softly through the cafe before fading into silence. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Another joined in. Soon, the entire cafe was filled with applause. People stood to their feet. Some had tears in their eyes. David sat quietly for a few seconds, then stood up and bowed his head slightly in thanks. The tall young man who had mocked him earlier stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Sir, I didn't know you could play like that, he said awkwardly, his voice quieter now. David smiled gently. It's all right, he said. Most people don't expect much from someone who looks like me. The young man looked down and placed the cash he had promised onto the piano. Keep it, and thank you. That was beautiful. David nodded but didn't reach for the money. Give it to someone who needs it, he said softly. I already got what I needed. The cafe owner came closer, still stunned. You played like a professional, he said. Where did you learn to do that? David hesitated. His eyes softened. A long time ago, he said. Before everything changed. Tom shook his head in disbelief. Well, that was the best thing this cafe's heard in years. You're welcome to play here anytime you want. David smiled faintly. Thank you, sir. He turned toward the door, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. For once, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, heard, respected. Outside, the evening light was dim and the street was quiet. He took a deep breath of the cool air. For the first time in a long while, he felt warm inside. Behind him, the sound of conversation returned to the cafe. Not laughter this time, but admiration. People were already talking about the man who had just played the dusty old piano, like it was made of gold. One of the young men came running out after him. Hey, he called. Wait, David stopped and turned. The young man held out a warm sandwich wrapped in paper. Please, he said. Take this. On us. David looked at the sandwich, then at the young man's face. For a moment he saw no mockery there, only respect. He accepted it quietly. Thank you, he said. The young man smiled. No, sir. Thank you. As David walked down the street holding the sandwich in his hand, he could still feel the echo of the piano keys beneath his fingers. For a few precious minutes he had been more than a man with a sign. He had been himself again, the man who once made people feel something just by touching a piano. And though he didn't know it yet, what happened in that small cafe was only the beginning. The video someone had recorded of his performance would soon travel far beyond that little corner of the city. The world was about to hear his story. When David walked away from the cafe that night, the city lights shimmered softly on the wet pavement. He walked slowly, holding the sandwich the young man had given him, still hearing the echo of the piano in his head, the warmth of the cafe, the sound of applause, the faces of people watching in silence. All of it played in his mind like a dream he wasn't ready to wake up from. He sat down under an old street lamp near the park and unwrapped the sandwich. The first bite tasted better than any meal he'd had in months. Maybe it wasn't just the food. Maybe it was the kindness behind it. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like just another face people passed by. That one song had reminded him who he was. Across the street, inside the cafe, the buzz hadn't died down. Customers still talked about what had just happened. The cafe owner, Tom, wiped the counter with a slow hand, still shaking his head in disbelief. That man. He played like he was born to do it, one customer said. Another added, I recorded the whole thing. People need to see this. Nobody's going to believe me otherwise. The sound of phones tapping filled the air as a few people posted the video online. Short clips showing David sitting at the dusty piano, his head slightly bowed, his fingers moving gracefully across the keys. The caption on one of them read, Homeless man walks into cafe, leaves everyone speechless. Within minutes, people started liking and sharing it. A few commented things like unbelievable talent. Gives me chills. Who is he? That night, the video began spreading beyond the small city street. By morning, it had thousands of views, but David didn't know that. He had no phone, no social media, and no idea that people were talking about him. He slept that night near a quiet alleyway, wrapped in his old jacket, the sound of the piano still alive in his dreams. When the morning sun came, he woke to the familiar hum of traffic. He stretched, brushed the dust off his clothes, and walked back toward the cafe. It was early, too early for the morning rush, but the smell of coffee already floated through the air. Tom noticed him through the window and opened the door. Hey there, he said. You're back early, David smiled softly. Just thought I'd thank you again, sir. For letting me play, Tom waved a hand. You don't owe me any thanks. You gave everyone in there something to talk about. I swear half the town's been in here this morning asking about you. David blinked, surprised. Asking about me? Tom chuckled. Yeah, someone filmed you playing. It's all over the internet. You're going viral, as they say. David frowned slightly. Viral? It means a lot of people are watching it. Like, a lot, Tom said. You should come see. He led David inside where one of the young baristas showed him the video on her phone. The clip showed him sitting at the piano, his fingers moving gently, the music floating through the air. The room in the video was quiet, except for the sound of the song and a few people sniffling in the background. As David watched, his lips parted slightly in disbelief. All these people, they're watching this? The barista nodded, smiling. It's beautiful. Everyone's saying you're amazing. For a moment, David didn't know what to say. He had lived for years without anyone noticing him. And now suddenly thousands of people were listening to something he had played. It didn't feel real. Tom patted his shoulder. You deserve it, he said. You've got a gift, man. People are finally seeing it. David smiled faintly. It's been a long time since anyone's called it a gift. The rest of the day passed in a blur. More customers came in asking about the man from the video. Some offered to buy him a meal. A local reporter even stopped by hoping to interview him. But David wasn't used to attention. He stayed quiet, humble, answering questions softly and never boasting. When the reporter asked about his past, he hesitated before saying, I used to play a lot before I joined the army. Things just changed after that. The reporter wrote that down, then smiled kindly. You've got a story people need to hear, she said. By evening, more videos of him had spread online, slowed down, edited, replayed with captions like never judge a book by its cover. People across the country began sharing his story. Some wrote comments saying they cried while watching. Others offered to help, asking how they could donate or find him. Tom realized quickly that this was bigger than he thought. You might want to get some rest, he told David that night. Tomorrow's going to be crazy. He wasn't wrong. By the next morning, television vans were parked down the street. Reporters waited outside the cafe with cameras, microphones, and big smiles. The moment David showed up, they surrounded him, not aggressively but eagerly. Sir, is it true you were homeless? Where did you learn to play like that? Do you plan to perform again? David stood still, blinking against the flashes of cameras. He wasn't angry or overwhelmed, and just surprised. I don't know what to say, he murmured. Tom quickly stepped in. Give him some space, folks. He's not used to all this attention. Inside, David sat quietly at a table as Tom brought him a cup of hot coffee. Looks like you're famous, Tom said with a grin. David smiled faintly. Fame doesn't feed a man, he said, half joking, half true. Tom laughed. Maybe not, but it can open doors. A few minutes later, a woman entered the cafe carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself as a representative from a local music foundation. We saw your video, she said warmly. We'd love to help you get back on your feet, maybe even get you back on stage. David looked stunned. Stage? It's been years since I've played anywhere but in my dreams, he said. She smiled. Then maybe it's time to change that. The following week moved faster than anything he'd ever experienced. A shelter offered him a clean place to stay. The foundation arranged new clothes for him and even a doctor's visit. For the first time in a long time, he saw himself in a mirror. Clean-shaven, hair trimmed, eyes a little brighter. It was strange. The man staring back at him looked like someone he used to know. The man he thought he'd lost somewhere along the way. But the biggest surprise came when a news station invited him to perform live. They wanted him to play the same song that had moved millions online. When they told him how many people had watched the video, he shook his head in disbelief. Millions, he repeated softly. All that? From one song? The producer smiled. One song that came straight from the heart, she said. The night before the performance, David barely slept. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of everything that had happened. He whispered to himself, Don't be afraid. Just play. The next day, as the cameras rolled and lights shone bright, David sat at the grand piano in the studio. It wasn't dusty like the cafe one. It was polished, beautiful, but still, it felt the same once his fingers touched the keys. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The same melody that had once filled a small cafe now filled living rooms across the country. The sound was soft at first, then powerful, carrying emotion that words couldn't express. Every note seemed to tell a story, of pain, of loss, but also of hope. When the final chord faded, there was silence, the kind that only comes when everyone is too moved to speak. Then came the applause, not from a cafe this time, but from an entire crew of people standing on their feet. Later, when the program aired, messages flooded in from everywhere. Veterans wrote to thank him for his service and his courage. Musicians praised his talent. Ordinary people shared how his story reminded them to look deeper before judging someone. David read some of the messages that Tom showed him on the cafe computer. He smiled quietly, humbled by every word. I never thought anyone would listen to me again, he said softly. Tom put a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the world just needs the right note to wake up. That evening, as David walked through the same streets where he had once been invisible, people recognized him. Some waved. Some stopped to shake his hand. He wasn't sure how to handle all the attention, but there was a lightness in his step now, the kind that comes when a man finds himself again. He still stopped by the cafe every day. Sometimes he played for a few minutes, sometimes he just sat outside quietly, watching people go by. But now the seat beside him never stayed empty for long. Strangers sat with him, talking, listening, asking questions. And though his story was still unfolding, one thing had already become clear. His music had done what words never could. It had reminded people that kindness still mattered, that talent can live even in the darkest places, and that sometimes the person the world ignores the most has the most beautiful song to play. The days that followed were unlike anything David had ever imagined. People recognized him now. Strangers stopped him on the street, shaking his hand, thanking him for his music. Every time someone smiled at him or called him by name, he still felt a little surprised. After so many years of being invisible, being seen felt like a dream he didn't want to wake from. The cafe had become a kind of second home for him. The same place where people once ignored him was now full of warmth and welcome. There was always a seat reserved for him near the piano, and someone would bring him a cup of coffee before he even asked. Every afternoon he would play for a few minutes. It wasn't a performance, not really. More like a conversation between him and the keys. People would pause their talks, stop their typing, and listen. The air would grow quiet as the music floated through the cafe like sunlight through a dusty window. One day, while he was playing, an older woman stood near the door, frozen. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened. When he finished, she slowly walked closer. "Excuse me," she said softly. "What's your name?" David looked up and smiled. "David Miller, ma'am." Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth. "It can't be," she whispered. He looked at her curiously. "Have we met?" She nodded, her eyes wide. "Years ago. You played at the State Concert Hall. I was a student back then. You performed a piece you wrote yourself. I never forgot it." David's expression softened. "That was a long time ago," he said gently. The woman smiled through her tears. "I knew I recognized that sound. The way you play, it's unmistakable." Their conversation drew the attention of a few others nearby. A young man sitting by the window quickly looked up David's name on his phone. His eyes widened. "Wait, and she's right," he said. "It says here that a pianist named David Miller used to perform all over the country. He was a prodigy before he joined the army." The cafe went quiet. People turned to look at David, surprise written all over their faces. Tom, the cafe owner, blinked in disbelief. "Is that true?" he asked softly. David hesitated for a moment, his fingers resting on the piano keys. Then he nodded. "It's true," he said quietly. "I used to play. A long time ago, before life took a different turn." No one spoke for a few seconds. The realization settled in like a wave rolling to shore. The man they had seen as a homeless stranger was once a celebrated musician. David smiled faintly, sensing the weight of their silence. "I guess life has a strange sense of humor," he said with a light chuckle. "One day you're on a stage under bright lights, and another day you're just hoping someone gives you a sandwich." The woman wiped her tears. "You were incredible back then. You still are." After she left, the cafe buzzed quietly with whispers. Some people recorded short clips, posting them online again. This time, the story carried a new headline: "The Homeless Man Who Turned Out to Be a Lost Piano Master." By evening, the news spread even further. Music channels, newspapers, and online pages began running stories about him. Old photos resurfaced. Pictures of a young man in a tuxedo, sitting proudly at a grand piano on stage, smiling confidently. Reporters came back the next day, asking him to tell his story. At first, he didn't want to. He wasn't interested in fame or pity, but eventually he agreed to talk, not to glorify his past, but to help people understand that life can break even the strongest hearts, and yet hope can still survive. He sat with one reporter who asked gently, "How did it all happen, Mr. Miller? You had everything: talent, recognition, success. What made you walk away from it all?" David took a deep breath, his hands folded on the table. "Music was my first love," he began slowly. "I started playing when I was 5. My parents didn't have much, but they saved up to buy a used piano for me. I practiced every day, and by the time I was in my 20s, I was playing on big stages. Life was good. But then I felt like I needed to do more, like something meaningful. That's when I joined the army. He paused for a moment, his voice quiet but steady. I served for several years, and when I came back, things weren't the same. The world had moved on, and I didn't know how to fit in anymore. I tried teaching music, but I couldn't keep it together. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I had lost my home, my job, and myself. The reporter listened carefully, her eyes soft. And yet, here you are again, she said. Playing inspiring people. David smiled gently. Music never left me, he said. Even when I lost everything else, it stayed inside me. I just needed someone to let me play again. When that interview aired, it touched millions. People shared it everywhere. Comments poured in from around the world. From other veterans, from musicians, from people who had once been down on their luck and found hope in his story. Messages read things like, "Thank you for reminding us that everyone has a story." I cried watching this. What a beautiful soul. This man deserves the world. Soon offers began coming in. A local symphony wanted him to perform as a guest pianist. A music school asked if he would teach students. The Veterans Foundation offered permanent housing. It was overwhelming, but David took it all humbly. He never acted like a celebrity. He still stopped by the cafe every day. He still smiled and said hello to everyone, even those who once ignored him. One morning, Tom asked him, "You ever think you'll go back on stage again?" David looked down at his hands and smiled. "Maybe," he said softly, "but not for applause. I'd do it to show people that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back." That evening, as he walked through the park, he saw a group of kids playing a small keyboard. Their fingers hit the wrong notes, but their laughter filled the air. One of them looked up at him and said, "Hey, mister, do you play?" David smiled. "A little," he said. The kids handed him the small keyboard, and he knelt down to play a simple tune. Something cheerful, something bright. The children's eyes widened, and soon they clapped and cheered. When he handed it back, one of the boys grinned. "You're really good." David chuckled. "So are you. Keep playing, all right? Music is like magic. It can take you anywhere." As he walked away, he felt a warmth in his chest that no spotlight could ever give. Later that week, the cafe hosted a small event in his honor. People packed the place, spilling onto the sidewalk. There were lights, cameras, and reporters, but David wasn't nervous. He sat at the same old piano, the one that started it all, and smiled. Before he began, he looked up and said, "I used to think my story ended the day I lost everything. But maybe the truth is it was just the start of a different kind of music." Then he started to play. The melody was soft, full of peace and gratitude. It carried through the open windows and out into the street. Passers-by stopped to listen. Some closed their eyes, some cried quietly. In that moment, it didn't matter who he had been or what he had lost. What mattered was what he had found, the connection between his music and the hearts of those who heard it. After the performance, people stood up and clapped for a long time. Tom came over and whispered, "You've changed this place, you know that?" David smiled. Maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it was the music. That night, as he walked home, he looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, but they were there, just like hope. Distant, but always shining. He thought about the people who had helped him, the ones who had believed in him, and even those who had mocked him once. He didn't feel anger toward anyone, just gratitude, because if life hadn't knocked him down, he might never have learned what it truly means to rise again. And though the world now knew who he was, the man behind the music, David still believed the most important part of his story wasn't about fame or talent. It was about kindness, redemption, and the quiet power of being seen when you've been invisible for too long. The piano had given him a voice again, and through it, he was finally telling his story, one note at a time. Weeks turned into months, and David's life began to change in quiet, beautiful ways. He now had a small apartment not far from the cafe. Nothing fancy, just a clean room with a soft bed, a desk, and a second-hand piano by the window. Every morning, sunlight would stream across the keys, and he'd play softly, letting the day begin with music. He still visited the cafe almost every day, not because of fame or attention, but because it felt like home. People greeted him warmly, not out of pity but out of genuine respect. Children often came by after school to listen or ask him questions about music. He loved those moments, teaching them a few notes, showing them how to feel the rhythm instead of just counting it. One morning, while he was sipping coffee and talking with Tom, the cafe owner, a man in a dark suit, walked in. He carried a briefcase and a kind but serious expression. He introduced himself as Mr. Lewis, a representative from the city's concert hall. "Mr. Miller," he said, shaking David's hand, "I'm here on behalf of the Symphony Committee. We've all seen your story and, well, we'd be honored if you would perform at our annual charity concert next month. It's for veterans and families in need." David blinked, speechless for a moment. "Me perform again?" he asked quietly. Mr. Lewis smiled. "Yes, sir. We'd love for you to close the evening. You'd be helping raise funds for others who've faced hard times. It would mean a lot to everyone." David didn't answer right away. The idea of returning to a grand stage stirred something deep inside him. Excitement mixed with fear. It had been years since he'd faced an audience that large. He wasn't sure if he was ready. But later that evening, as he sat by his window, watching the sunset turn the sky gold, he thought about everything that had happened. The laughter, the humiliation, the rediscovery, and the kindness that followed. He realized this wasn't about fame or proving himself. It was about giving back the hope that others had given him. The next day he called Mr. Lewis and said simply, "I'll do it." From that moment, the weeks flew by in a blur of preparation. The organizers arranged everything: transportation, rehearsals, and even a proper suit for him to wear. He practiced every day, sometimes for hours, though not with the same hunger for perfection he once had. This time he played with feeling, not ambition. Every note carried a story, every pause held a memory. The night of the concert arrived. The city glowed with lights as people gathered at the Grand Hall. The audience included veterans, families, musicians, and reporters who had followed his journey from the start. The hall was full, every seat taken. Backstage, David sat quietly, his fingers gently tapping against his knees. He wasn't nervous, just deeply aware of the moment. A young stagehand came by and said, "Mr. Miller, they're ready for you." David stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and walked toward the stage. As he stepped into the light, the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. The applause lasted so long that he had to wait for it to fade before sitting at the grand piano in the center of the stage. For a moment, he just sat there, looking out at all the faces. He saw kindness, curiosity, admiration, and in a few eyes, understanding. He smiled gently and spoke into the microphone. "Thank you for being here tonight," he said. His voice was calm, almost like a whisper. "A year ago, I was sitting on a street corner holding a sign that said, 'Can I play for food?' I didn't know that a small moment of kindness would lead me here. I thought my story was over, but maybe life was just waiting for me to find my music again." The hall was silent, listening. "I don't play tonight for fame or applause," he continued softly. "I play to remind you and myself and that no one is truly lost. Sometimes we just need someone to listen." He turned back to the piano, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. The first notes were gentle and slow, like a whisper from the past. The melody grew warmer, brighter, a reflection of everything he had lived through. There was sorrow in it, yes, but also forgiveness, hope, and gratitude. The audience sat completely still, as if afraid to breathe. When he reached the final movement, the music swelled, full of emotion. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was his story, unfolding in front of them. Each note spoke of the years he'd spent in silence, the pain of being forgotten and the joy of finding his way back. And when the final note faded into the still air, there was a long moment of silence. Then, as if the whole room took a breath together, the audience stood and erupted in applause. It was thunderous, endless, full of warmth. David stood slowly and bowed. Tears shimmered in his eyes. For the first time in many years, he felt completely at peace. After the concert, people came to meet him backstage, fellow veterans, families, students. They thanked him for his courage, his music, and his message. One young boy handed him a small piece of paper with a hand-drawn piano on it and said shyly, "I want to play like you one day." David smiled and knelt down to meet his eyes. "You will," he said. "Just promise me something. Play with your heart, not just your hands." Later that night, when everyone had gone home, David walked back to the stage. The hall was empty now, the lights dimmed. He sat down at the piano once more and played a soft, simple tune, just for himself. As he played, he remembered all the faces he had seen that night, all the kind people who had helped him when he had nothing. He thought about the laughter, the tears, the nights he had slept on park benches, and the strangers who had offered him food and compassion. Every piece of his life, every struggle, had led him here, to this quiet, perfect moment. When he finished, he looked up at the dark, empty seats and whispered, "Thank you." The echo of his voice filled the hall like a prayer. In the weeks that followed, David's performance became a symbol of hope across the city. Schools invited him to talk to students about resilience. Music programs were inspired to create scholarships for struggling veterans. People who had seen his story online wrote to him, sharing their own experiences of loss and rediscovery. He never saw himself as a hero. Whenever someone called him that, he would simply smile and say, "I'm just a man who found his way back through music." He continued to live simply, teaching children at the local community center, visiting the cafe, and helping at the veteran shelter. He used some of the donations he received to buy instruments for others who couldn't afford them. "Everyone deserves a chance to make music," he'd say. Sometimes he would walk to the same street corner where it all began. The cafe piano could still be seen through the window, and people still talked about the day the music changed everything. He'd stand there quietly, remembering the cold bench, the laughter, and that first trembling note that had changed his life. One afternoon, a woman passing by stopped and said, "Aren't you the piano man?" He smiled. "I suppose I am," she grinned. "Thank you for what you did. My son started piano lessons after watching your video." "That's wonderful," he said softly. "Tell him to keep playing. The world always needs more music." When she walked away, David looked up at the sky. The same blue, the same clouds, the same city. But somehow, everything felt lighter. He took a slow breath and sat on the bench, closing his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a busker strummed a guitar, and the melody floated through the air. He smiled to himself. Music was everywhere now, not just in pianos or grand halls, but in hearts, in laughter, in life. And though people would always remember him as the homeless veteran who shocked the world with his piano, David knew the truth was simpler. He wasn't defined by where he had been or what he had lost. He was defined by what he had found again: kindness, purpose, and peace. As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the city in shades of gold and red, David stood, stretched his back, and began walking home. He passed by the cafe, where someone was softly playing on the piano inside. He stopped for a moment, listening. The tune was familiar, the same one he had played that first day. He smiled, his heart full. "Keep going," he whispered under his breath. "Let the music live." And with that, he walked away into the evening, the sound of the piano following him like a memory, like a promise, proof that even in the hardest moments, beauty can still be found, and that a single song played with heart can change a life forever.